Father, thank you for this evening. Thank you for the time we'll get to spend together. Father, I pray for the conversation and the time that it would go smoothly, and that we would honor you with it, and that we could get through this material, and we might be able to share the gospel with people that will be encountering more and more with these ideas. And so, Lord, we just thank you for this time. In your Son's name, amen. All right, so I'm going to try to get through this whole packet tonight.
Wow.
Yeah. So, here we go. All right, so real quick. So, when we talk about worldviews, okay, so we've been talking about what worldviews are, and we've kind of hit on that with theism, right? We talked about that. Theism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. Pantheism is things like Hindu and Buddhism. Occultism is things like Wiccan and Satanism. Modernism is things like Deism, Agnosticism, Atheism, and then postmodernism is things like nihilism and existentialism. Now, you don't need to know all that. Really what we need to talk about is a worldview is how people view the world through a certain understanding. So if you're a theistic person, right, if you believe in theism, that means you believe that there is a God. You're going to believe, and then you can filter down. This is why I say things like, I can figure out what people believe just by asking questions, right? And pretty fast. You could do this very blatantly. Do you believe in God or not? And if someone says, I do. Okay, so there already you have gotten rid of agnosticism, atheism, nihilism. You've already got rid of those worldviews. And so then you ask them, do you believe in one God? And they say, I do believe that there is only one God. You have just got rid of Hinduism and Buddhism.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you believe in the Abrahamic God? I do. Okay, you got rid of everything. Now you just have Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Do you believe Jesus is a prophet? I do. You're Islam. Like, that's how, so in 4 questions, we just moved. I know exactly what you believe because you believe Jesus is a prophet. And so it's things like that. It's just, you can be very direct and figure it out within 5 questions what someone believes, just by asking them, do you believe in God? Does that make sense? And so we've kind of gone through most of these, atheism, pantheism, occultism. We're tackling now modernism. Now, if we only get through modernism, that's good enough. I'd like to get at least through nihilism. We won't do that today, but at least some of you will be gone. So we'll try to get through it, modernism. So we're going to start with one modernist worldview, which is deism. Okay, so Peter Kreeft, he wrote, most theists are deists most of the time in practice, if not in theory. They practice the absence of God instead of the presence of God. So he's just making a commentary on what people do. We as Christians actually believe in a personal, right here, interacting with this God. Or do we kind of just use God as like, oh, I believe in him, but I do my own thing type of belief system. That's what he's talking about. But deist, the word deist, it's a joint word, deus, meaning God. So Dios in Spanish. And so this idea, French, that the word isme, which is a suffix that turns a verb into an action, noun indicates action, condition, or language. Ism taken from the Greek language. So this idea of deism, God, okay, so that idea of God, what is the action that's happening? That's what we're talking about. The word, and I'm going to butcher this because I don't speak French, deisme, or whatever, in French was used starting around 1865. So you got that? 1675, sorry, 1675. So in the 17th century. And in the 17th century is when we start seeing the Enlightenment really take hold. It starts really going. And you have a lot of these philosophers that start coming out of the Enlightenment period. And understand that this is also the foundation of some of the Enlightenment, some of the stuff that filters into the Americas. for the Revolutionary War when we get to that point. But the difference is, what's interesting, if you look at the Revolutionary War in the US and the Revolutionary War in France, they have a different basis. So the one in the US was a God-fearing basis. That's what it was biblically based, and it might have used some of these ideas from the Enlightenment, but it wasn't based on those ideas, the humanistic ideas. Whereas the French Revolution was based on humanistic ideas. And so out of those come very different revolutions. And so, but the definition that starts being used is this idea of a movement or system of thought advocating natural religion, emphasizing morality, and in the 18th century, so in the 1700s, right, this is what's going on, in the 18th century, denying the interference of the Creator with the laws of the universe. So this idea of denying Creator is kind of the basis of deism, but we're not to the point of atheism, like the actual denial of God. But it starts walking through this. The definition that we use in this is, in deism, God created the world, but then left it to run on its own like a clock wound up. And so you might have heard things like, well, there was, some of the founders were deists. Not in the same thought as modern deism. So modern deism has more of this idea that God created and then completely left it. That's this idea. And when you hear things like Thomas Jefferson was a deist or Benjamin Franklin was a deist, they're not a deist in the same sense. They believe that God did interact. It's just how much did he interact? That was the question. Because one of the last, what's it called? Speeches. One of the last speeches that what's his name? Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin gave to Congress was this, they were dealing with the Constitution, and he says, we all need, we need to remember that God gave us this. Like, God did all this. So we must go to the churches and pray and then come back. And so he was the one that because they came to a stalemate on the Constitution, and so they moved to churches and they prayed and they sought the Lord, and they came back, and it was within like a day that they finalized everything. And so the idea that they were deists in the modern sense is completely unfounded. They were deists in the sense of how much did God actually interact. They still believe he did things, but not on the scale of maybe like a everyday personal thing. Does that make sense? Like, some of them believe that he only worked in big things, like the movement of governments, the raising of kings, stuff like that, but maybe not in everyday personal issues. Mm-hmm. So it's a different idea of what a deist is from then till the modern day. And so we have to understand that it's not just the same thing. So this kind of just gives you the idea of what the difference between theists and deists are when we start talking about the modern understanding of it. It's God creates, so this is theism. God creates and personally interacts with everything in the world. That is the theistic God of the Bible. Okay? Where deism is God creates, but then allows it to run on its own. So you can see that it's already a movement away from the pure form of Christianity, which is God is here and personal. All right. Do we have that in there? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right. So just to give you an idea, just a quick history of deism. So in the 17th century, so we're talking about the 1600s, right? With the scientific revolution, that's kind of where all this starts going. So when we start really seeing the scientific revolution going, you have things that influence it, like the Renaissance. Those types of things that have influence. So the problem with saying this is where things start is it's never that cut and dry, right? Everything starts because something before it. I just saw something today or yesterday on someone's like, well, if the people back in the early 1900s were so smart, how come they didn't invent cell phones? And someone told them, you do understand that everything has to develop. Like, if we couldn't have smartphones unless they developed certain things, and they couldn't have certain things unless someone before them developed something. Like, so they were questioning the person's understanding of like how things develop. And that's really what it is so the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution really starts from things like the Renaissance, where we're capturing all these different ideas. And then they started rejecting the ability to know God through special revelation, so through the Bible. So this becomes an issue for people. Can you understand God through the Bible? And it's really because of this idea of scientific. So we can know God through out here. How do we know God through here? It becomes an issue. And so they believe that God could only be known through reason and nature, which is really interesting because before this, if you go back through all of Greek history, Roman history, early medieval and all this, reason takes a back seat to things like rhetoric. Like rhetoric is the big thing. So convincing someone to believe something that you believe is more important than actually if it's real or not. Like that's more important. And so it wasn't until people like Thomas Aquinas and these theologians really started diving in, and they're actually having apologetics against the Muslim world, where they're like, no, this truth is truth, right? This is unmovable truth, absolute truth. That we start seeing this change in how things are. Scientific revolution, truth is truth, right? This type of stuff. So all of it has these roots in other places. But at this time, they start rejecting that this is the Word of God. That this is how God reveals Himself. And they start only working on against the mind. And we start seeing the humanism of the Renaissance start flourishing in the 17th century. And so then they were actually called atheists, not deists. And what's interesting is the word atheist gets thrown around a lot throughout human history. So the Romans called Christians atheists at one point because they didn't believe in the pantheism of gods, and Zeus and Herod and all that. So they didn't believe in all those, and so Christians were called atheists. And because deists didn't believe in the absolute interaction with God, they were called atheists because they were denying God. And so that term is being used throughout history for different people depending on their beliefs. But they're atheists in that sense. And so when we define them, it's more of a deistic. That's why we use the term deist, not atheist. Okay? But they start rejecting things like biblical inerrancy, that the Bible is the Word of God passed down. They deny things like the Trinity. And so they start asking the questions. And we actually start seeing this later on in the 1800s, which leads to Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, these other groups who deny things like the Trinity, and all that starts in the 1600s. And then it's developed in the 1700s. And then in the 1800s, we start seeing it more and more. And then even things like miracles. So Jesus, this is where the modern thing is. Jesus really didn't walk on water. It was, one thing I heard was, it was actually at sometimes during the different seasons, ice sheets can form on Galilee, and that's actually how Jesus walked on water. So it's this idea of, okay, it couldn't be a supernatural thing. It had to be something natural that we can explain. And so the idea of rejecting miracles, and so that's where some of these things lead. And so today, we would say there's two forms of deism, right? The classical sense, and that's that tend to reject God's intervening in human history on the personal level, right? He doesn't really do the personal. Whereas a modern one, they say, yeah, he can, but he really doesn't. Okay? So he rarely does. So these are just two different forms of deism. that we can kind of say. So a modern deist would say, yeah, well, he will, but he really doesn't. So it's actually a reversal. It's going even back. So if you would put theism here and deism over here, classical would be over here, and then modern would actually move closer to theism. You have a more modern take on it. So it's actually more theistic than even they were. So the idea of like deism, where we're just like, it's a strict thing of God creates and then leaves, isn't really what is practiced, if that makes sense. That's kind of just people's idea, where it's like, oh, deists believe this, and they don't really believe that. They just believe in an overt movement of God at all times in all spaces. So where in theism, that's what we'd say. God is working every day in people's lives at every moment. They would say, no, only in big things. He can do that, but rarely does he do that. Does that make sense? So that's kind of what we're talking about. So the deist answers to the 7 questions. So these are pretty quick. That's why I said we could probably get through a bunch of these. So the deist answer to the 7 questions. And you need to see how these kind of walk down. That's why I like to do these all at once, like the deist, atheist, or agnostic atheist. Because what you'll actually see is actually a walk down in belief. So we're in theism, right? So we start with prime reality. Theism, what is prime reality? The theist would say God, right? He's prime reality. So in deism, they would say transcendent God. Okay, that's the same thing as Christianity, basically. Except they really emphasize the transcendentness of God. So where we would say God, they would say the transcendent God, meaning that he's more above, right? Less interactive. We would say the personal God, they would say the transcendent God. See the slight difference there? The personal God is someone that interacts all the time. Transcendent God is one that's above and only rarely interacts. And they would say, as a first cause created the universe, but then left it to run on its own, God is not immanent, not fully personal, not sovereign over human affairs, not providential. Where the Christian would say, no, he's all those things. He's immanent, he's personal, he's sovereign over human affairs, he is providential. So, but you see how it's still there, but it's just like 1 degree separated. Does that make sense? And what you're going to see is that once we move 1 degree, we move it 1 more degree, and we move 1 more degree. And that's all of these in a stair step down. So what is the nature of external reality, the world around us? We would say that's everything, right? The universe, creation. They would say the cosmos God created is determined because it's created as a uniformity of cause and effect. In a closed system, no miracles are possible. This is really important to understand. This is a big change. So theism, if we're over here with theism, we would say that it is an open system. What this means is, if we have, this is all of creation. So all stars, planets, everything, okay? This is creation. God is outside of it. So this is God, this is creation. But God interacts in it in an open system, meaning he can come in and do miracles. He can come in and speak to you. He can come in and do whatever he wants. A closed system, so this is where we start going on to deism. And this is, to me, one of the big things. They have, so if we wanted to, we can kind of make it more open, because it is distinct from God, but he can come in and deal with it. A closed system is where nothing from the outside can enter. It would be like, you're in your car and the rock hits it, bounces off. You're in a closed system, right? If you put on that little, you have the car thing on in your vehicle, and it has those little wavy lines, the little button. You push on there, and it's supposed to like recycle the air type of thing, right? That's a closed system. That's the idea. And so you had this closed system. Now, deism, it's not exactly closed, right? It's mostly closed, but God still can come in and do things when he wants to. But this is where we move that 1 degree. We move it from an open system where God can interact the entire world to a closed system, and I would say more specifically a slightly closed system. Meaning God can still do things, but he rarely does. Does that make sense so far? Because this is another one of those things, it's 1 degree. You're going to see it go more and more. But this is the first time you'll see it. So what is a human being? Human beings, though personal, this is big. Though personal, meaning we have personality, we can interact with each other, we have uniqueness. God did create the universe so that we may be unique within it. We're still part of a clockwork universe. Well, this is important because later on it becomes even more important. Basically, everything is, so the first cause causes this, and everything else is just a cause from that first cause. So there is a tension between determinism and free will. Because you are determined from that first cause to be who you are. But at the same time, you're still personal, so you do have some sort of free will. There is that within here. Where this free will, at least for the first humans, depending on your theological standing on free will, at least for the first humans were possible. Whereas this one, it wasn't. Determinism is always the thing. This is something that later on will be removed. Free will be removed. And it only becomes deterministic. Like that's it. So when we get to atheism, it's only deterministic. It's only closed closed system. That's all what's going on. What happens to a person after death? Now, this is very similar to the theistic. Okay, person will cease to exist, or will have will give an account to God for their life. Okay, that's close to theism, because again, we're still working with a God, right? Even though it's more of an absent God, it's still God. So God still does interact. So it's similar, but you can start seeing that everything else is starting moving away. Why is it possible to know anything at all? The cosmos in this world is understood to be in its normal state, the way it is. So for us as believers, we would say what happened was God created a perfect world. And then what happens to that perfect world? Sin. Right? Genesis 3. So sin infects the world. In a deistic idea, no. The world is exactly the way it's supposed to be. This is how it is. God created this to be in this way. So that's a huge difference, right? And which one puts the emphasis on God creating evil or creating the bad things that happen, right? Mm-hmm. So in this one, it's us. We are the ones that cause the issues of the world. In this one, it's because God set it up that way. This becomes really big when we start asking those deeper questions of why do bad things happen, right? How could a loving God also allow sin or allow death and destruction and evil?
Takes the load off of us.
It does. Yeah, it puts it back on the God and says, well, God just designed it that way, that's it. Yeah, and so and puts it back on the God. And so that becomes something, so they would say it's not a fallen world, it's not abnormal, okay? But how can we know anything? Because we can study the cosmos. So we can study the cosmos, and that's how we can know that there's a God. All right? Number 6, how do we know what is right and wrong? So ethics is limited to general revelation. Because the universe is normal, it reveals what is right. So this is where you look into the animal kingdom and say, okay, well, how do they do things? Okay, that must be good or bad, right? Why do we call murder murder? Well, it's not because God says it's bad, but because there's a humanistic reason behind it. Because if I murder someone, right, if we lived in a society where I could just go and murder, Ted down the road, that would throw our society into chaos because, well, you couldn't go outside without knowing if Frank's over here going to kill you, right? And so that's what they're saying is that's how we know what's right and wrong because of the consequences of it. And that leads us into the other worldviews. And so once we move away from theism, we just keep moving away more and more. What is the meaning of human history? It's still linear. For the course of the cosmos is determined at creation. And you're going to see some of these things just continue as we move further and further down the worldview line. And so ethics is limited to general revelation, and the universe reveals what's right. And then the meaning of human history is just a linear form. Now, we agree with that as theists. The only difference is it determined at creation? Like, that's the difference. And depending on your theological bent, you might say, oh yeah, it was determined at creation, or no, it wasn't, or in between.
So is that why they believe that you can have abortion and all this stuff?
So when we get down that far, so a deist wouldn't believe that,
Right.
because that wouldn't be what God revealed in general. But as we move further and further away from that, yeah, because that becomes something that is completely detached from anything that God did. Yeah. All right. So, what can a Christian take away from the deist? Okay. So the understanding that God is able to be known through His creation with the mind He gave us. This is something that's really important. We agree that we can know the Lord through general revelation. Like that is a tier of biblical revelation. So when we talk about what revelation is, there's 2 tiers. One is general revelation, that's the creation around us. The other one is special revelation, which is the Bible. The deist only has the one, which is general revelation. The Christian has 2, special and general. And so we have a more solid basis, but we can use our mind to understand God. Like, it's not so far gone. And this is actually, so within Christianity, we do have these discussions of determinism and free will, and how far does the sin mar our ability to know God and seek after Him. We have those discussions. But in deism, there is no discussion. It is the deterministic side. Like, that's it. So you can't have that discussion because there's no possible way for that discussion to even happen. So we can agree with at least this. How can the Christian reach out to the deist? So for the Christian, it's the personal story of God's interaction with us. Like, that's why verses like where Jesus says in Acts 1:8, you will be my witnesses, like that type of language is really important because our personal testimony is integral to our presentation of the gospel. Like us as individuals, we don't just say, hey, accept Jesus as your Savior, and that's it. It's accept Jesus as your Savior because I have known Him, and I want you to know Him. Like, that is the reason behind that. Like, there's a personal testimony that goes along with our presentations of the gospel. So it's never just, it's a thought idea. It's a real idea. Like we are actually transformed in some way by Jesus. It's not purely academic. Does that make sense? So we're not just be like, well, there is an argument for God. And if you believe that argument, then you accept Jesus as your Savior. Okay, that's just an argument for God. To accept Jesus as your Savior is a personal encounter with the living God. It's, I'm a sinner, I need a Savior, like that. And so what we see within the scriptures is personal encounters with Jesus, right? The woman at the well, Zacchaeus in the tree, you know, all these moments of personal interaction with Jesus. So that's a huge thing. Because if God is just distant and doesn't interact, he's not personal. But he is personal. I've encountered him. So that's, how can that both be true, right?
And sometimes you don't even have to say anything. My brother-in-law passed away a year ago this coming April. And we had his memorial. And so they gave opportunity to people to speak up, you know, say something about it. And there was a fireman there that he said, I worked with Dwayne for, I don't know how many years at the fire department. He said, never said a thing, but his life is what drew me and caused me to accept the Lord into my life.
Yeah.
You know, because Dwayne was a very quiet person, but his life exhibited Christ, and because of that, he accepted the Lord into his life.
That's part of the witness,
Mm-hmm.
right? Yeah. So the witness part is really important. All right, so we got that, deism. Okay, so let's talk about modernism. Now,
These people must live in a fog of depression.
no, not yet, because you still have God. Like, God still creates. And so, even if the deist, a deist can accept the idea of Jesus as Savior. Because if he does interact on big things, that would be a big thing. Yeah. So, but what we're going to see is one step, right? One step away, one step away, one step away. That's where we start seeing the depression. And if you follow this, you will get to the depression. So nihilism is the end result of all of this. And when we get there, you'll see like why. Because it does get to that state. You can see it as a believer, because once you step away from the personal God, what is there? There's nothing. Yeah, it's you now as a human having to create reality, right? To create hope and create all these things. Whereas a believer goes, God does that. Like, God gives peace. God gives understanding. God gives joy. And when I know him, I know those things. But for someone that doesn't know God personally, what's left? It's just me. So as a believer, you can see that this leads to that, you know. So modernism, even though in the if you take classes, deism would fall under more of a modernistic view. I talk about it as a stepping stone to modernism, because the modern world is a rejection of God. Like, it rejects God. So deism, I view it as more of a stepping stone and not under the modern view. Does that make sense? So if you look it up in a textbook, they'll probably put deism under the modern view. I don't hold to that idea. I hold to more of a stepping stone to the modern view. So Arthur Erickson, he puts modernism released us. So this is why I say that. Modernism released us from the constraints of everything that had gone before with a euphoric sense of freedom. So what he's saying is, modernism released us from God. That's where he'll take it. And so that's why I say I don't put deism, because modernism is this idea of a rejection of God. Deism doesn't fit right there. It fits in the in-between state. So, that definition, it says a deliberate philosophical and practical estrangement or divergence from the past in arts and literature, occurring especially in the course of the 20th century, which would be the 1900s, and taking form in any various innovative movements and styles. Now, I would disagree with that of the 20th century. I would say it starts, its roots are in the 1700s. It really starts holding in the 1800s, especially the late 1800s, when the revolution, industrial revolution really takes hold. in the second industrial revolution. And then in the 20th century, we start really seeing it like go bonkers. So I would say slightly different, but this is basically the idea. That's philosophical. It's an estrangement or divergence from the past in about, I would say, the 19th century is when I would say that's when it starts. So, in other words, a rejection of non-empirical reason-based belief that could not be explained using other means. So, what you're going to see under modernism is this rejection. So, where deists said we can only know God through the scientific process, right? Through our reasoning, through general revelation. Modernism will just say no. There's nothing, right? Nothing can be explained unless we physically can explain it. So it doesn't matter your feelings, it doesn't matter your witness, it doesn't matter anything. If it can't be empirically done, scientifically done, A plus B equals C done, it has no worth. Like, that's the idea. It's a complete rejection of any feelings or anything like that. So, why are you the way you are? Well, it's because of psychology. So we get people like Freud. Well, the reason you feel like that is because of your mother, right? There's always a reason why, because you're physical, right? And once we figure out what is physically wrong, we can fix whatever it is. So that's the idea that is being done here. So it's just a rejection of anything that's non-empirically based. That's the key to modernism. So to kind of give you a history of modernism, here's the road to it. And this gives you a big overview. Okay, this is why I said everything has its roots somewhere else. So the road to modernism starts in the Renaissance. So it starts in the 1300s as we rediscovered in Europe, rediscovered the philosophers of the 1800s. That's where we can really start seeing this. And this starts with this other idea of humanism. So even though the ancient idea of humanism is different than the modern idea, it still has its roots at the human level. And so once we go from it's all about God, and we begin to even step away from that idea into what does the human bring to this, we already start seeing the move away from God that leads to the modern idea. And so you have the Renaissance of the 14th century in Italy and other places rediscovering the works of the Greek philosophers. Okay? This then leads, so in your notes you won't have this part, it'll just be this, so don't worry about that part. This led to new ideas about the world around us, new directions in art and music, and a new type of humanism. So why do we start sailing, right? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? That's because of this understanding of, well, the world's a sphere. Like, even though everyone agreed it was a sphere, no one believed that it was flat at this point. But how big of a sphere? Can I get to India through the west instead of going east like we've had done for centuries, right? It's a challenging of those ideas and the human spirit. This is when we start talking about things like that, like the drive to explore, the drive to go to new lands and to face those things that we used to think were out there, but now aren't. We don't believe so much that they are, you know, and so we start moving in this direction, in this more humanistic direction. Are we good to go with this, to change? Good, okay. So to continue that, so this time period lasts into the 17th century, right? So this is the deistic stuff. So now the deistic stuff is starting, right? That's what we talked about when we talked about deism, where it's okay. So yes, we believe God creates, but we don't see him doing the miracles of the Old Testament, right? We don't see the feeding of the 5,000. We just see normal humans do normal things for normal time over the centuries. So God must not be doing those things. Those must be myths. Those must be just things that were put down to help us. And so a new way to approach the Bible happens. It's all allegorical. It's all metaphorical. It's not really happening. It was just things that were put down to help us believe God. Like, that's it. Or to explain things that happen without God. Right? So just this idea, so that's what we're talking about. And then we come to the Enlightenment. And so it's at the Enlightenment that things start popping off. So a product of the advancements in technology of the 16th to the 19th centuries. So from the 1500s into the 1800s, we start seeing just a massive change, right? We go from, in this time period, we go from bows and arrows to rifles, to repeating rifles, right? We go from selling ships to steamships, right? We go from horse and carriage to locomotives and the cars that will eventually start taking over in the 20th century, right? So we start seeing this massive change that had, before that, horse and buggy or horse and cart, thousands of years, that's how people got around. And all of a sudden now we're just rapidly changing. Our technology just rapidly changes within these 4 to 5 centuries. And it's crazy to see it. And so it goes back to this idea, the common people. So now the common people are becoming more educated. So this would be your next thing. Common people become more educated. So why? Because back in the 1500s, right, you have the printing press. And so, or late 1400s, early 1500s, you have the printing press, and now information is starting to become more mass produced, especially in the 1800s. Now you can go and you can start a magazine, right? You can go and start your own newspaper, and you can get all these things, and now it becomes one at a time, right? And doing this, and then, okay, we do a page, or we do a section, and now we can do multiple pages. Now we can do more. And now you can buy the stuff, and as in the Alliance, they start their own magazine, and they do all the printing themselves. That was unheard of a century before. And so all this starts happening, and more people get educated. More people have access to all these Greek philosophers and all these writers. And now more people are writing, and producing books and all these things. And this becomes a huge thing. Now you can actually go, common people, right? It was the aristocrats that got to go to university, that got to go to these things. Now it's the common person. They can go to university. They can extend their education. And so aristocratic political power, social norms, and scientific presuppositions begin to be challenged. This is what happens in Russia, right? So the Bolsheviks, right? That revolution. All of a sudden you have, here's the king, right? The emperor of Russia, and now the common people rise up. And this is communism, right? Communism flourishes under this idea of it's the masses. They're the ones that are in control, and so they're to overthrow those in the power. So all this stuff is happening more and more. Even here in the U.S., right? We deserve to be represented rightly. We deserve to have a voice. Like, that comes from the Enlightenment period, from the more education for the lower classes, and here it becomes freedom. That's, we want to be free to be our own destiny makers, types of things. And so all this is happening under the Enlightenment period. And so the ideal of liberty is huge, right? Liberty for all people, the realization that the earth was not the center of the universe, and political wars all ate away at the presupposed cultural beliefs of European life. And we have to understand that's a huge thing. Like, the Enlightenment, modern thought, that's a Western idea that gets taken to places like China and places like Japan. It's not the other way around. And how does this idea start getting spread? Through the British Empire. Like, Britain, Britain had a bigger impact than just taking over societies. It was, they brought these Western ideas to these other places. So why does India feel that they need to become their own country? Because they're learning about this idea of liberty, right? And so all this, like, it's being built in Europe and being spread to other places. But what you'll see is, when we get into the 60s and 70s, that there's actually a response to this in the Middle East, and that's where you get jihadists and things like that. So we don't cover that, but that's actually a response to the modern thought that's being perpetuated throughout the world. And then it's a return away from modernity to the Muslim world as it was under Muhammad type of stuff. So that's a whole different thing. But so what we call the modern world era, so this is the 1900s. We have the Industrial Revolution now in a completely different form, but it's in full swing. Communication and educational pursuits were now common, right? We get later on into the 50s, into the 60s. Now you can be whatever you want to be, right? You go to college, you can become a doctor, become a lawyer. You can, the middle class just soars, right? Before that, you really didn't have a middle class in the same way as we would talk about in the modern sense. But this is where we are now. Everything we built in our modern world is based in modern worldview, in a modern worldview. What's interesting is theism can work within a modern worldview. Like, it can, because it's based on, this is where we start really talking about how do we prove God. And when we say things like, if you look at the cell, right? You have single cell, but you don't have two cells organism. You just have a single cell and then it jumps, right? It like explodes. And why is that? Well, we say, well, God creates. Right? He creates specific things to work within a specific way and then creates other things. That comes from a modern worldview. Like the walking through, we believe this because of this, because of this. That's modern, like the way of approaching things. So in the ancient world, we would say, well, it's already assumed God. Like that's an assumption that's already there. And then we're just bickering over, well, are we free will or are we determined? Does that make sense? Like, the whole world for centuries was, no, God's presupposed. No one believes anything else. We're just bickering over the details. In the modern world, that's not assumed. So how do I get there? And this is one of the things we've talked about before. So a modern way of approaching God is this idea of, right, we said this a while back, there are three ways of viewing the universe, right? You have God created, right? So God created, and then you have the material world. So either a God created or there's a material world, right? Like those are the only two things. Well, we talk about how in the early 1900s, science, so in the 1900s, it's actually in the 1920s to 30s, science proved that the universe is not eternal. This is done through Hubble. Okay? So, the universe is not eternal. It strikes off right at the bat, atheism. It also strikes off any belief system that says eternal. So Hinduism is false. That means there's really only one way to go, and that's an Abrahamic faith. Okay, so this is a modern argument for God. We start with, is the universe eternal? Science proved it's not. Atheism, you're wrong. Hinduism, wrong. we only go to the Abrahamic religions. Already we just proved that God exists. There you go. By those 3 steps, we prove that God exists. Now, which Abrahamic God? Okay. Jesus said that he was going to resurrect. So now we go through an argument on the resurrection. On the resurrection, to prove that Jesus resurrected. And because he resurrected, he is the creator God. Therefore, Christianity is the only true religion. That is a modern way to approach showing that God exists. You want to do that in the 1300s because it was assumed God existed. So now we're talking about something completely different. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So this is why I say that theism can work within a modernistic worldview, because we have brains. Okay? So, but this is just one of those things that we need to recognize as we're talking about this. So the next one here is people from all backgrounds have easier exact access to share their views. And we see this even more, right? So now anyone can produce a book. Like you can write a book and you can get it on Amazon. You can self-publish books. You can write a blog. You can do a tweet. You can, we have so much knowledge and so much people's opinions that how do you go through all that? It's just everywhere. So it doesn't matter how educated. Before, it was only those that were educated that could put forth anything. Now it's anyone can do it. And that's all because of modernism. Like it has its roots in it. So, then, due to the achievements that humanity saw, humanism began to flourish. Look what we did. This is if we look at Babel, and in the Babel story, it says, look what we have done. That is humanism. Like that idea, look at what the humans have done. We have created this great thing. That is modernism. The humanistic idea. We have created this great things. We created vaccines. We created cars. We went to the moon. Look at all the things humans did. Look how great we are. And so where Paul talks about how we worship the creation rather than the creator, this is exactly what it is. We are worshiping the human instead of the creator. And so that is the modern world. So God then is seen as unnecessary, an unnecessary need of the past when less evolved men needed to explain things like the weather. So this is the idea. In the modern conversation about this would be called the God of the gaps. So when we didn't understand something, we inserted God. Why is there lightning? God did it. Why is there floods? God did it. Why is there disease? God did it. So that's the idea. So the modern thought is, well, we just use God as kind of a placeholder until we figured out the reasons why. And that's called the God of the gaps theory. So when you get to this point now, okay, so you can kind of see theism, God creates, God does. Deism, God created, but he left. Now you get into the modern worldview, and do we need God is the idea. And that's kind of when we get into the smaller worldviews of agnosticism and atheism, you actually see these questions start popping up. And so modernism is a big umbrella of ideas. So the modern man was to now believe that the only thing that was real around us was the natural world. Therefore, God was no longer needed and should be thought of as a fairy tale, as a myth. And not in the same way that C.S. Lewis uses myth. He uses it a totally different way. But, so that's where we are with the modern idea. So this is where we are today. That the modern man doesn't need God. We have evolved far enough to where we no longer need him. And we can just look back and laugh and, oh, look at those dumb people of the past. And this is actually, I've had conversations with people that will say just that. Well, those people in the past were just dumb. And I'm not talking like hundreds and thousands of years ago. I've had people say like 50, 60 years ago, oh, well, those people were just dumb. It's like, man.
How did God is dead come into this?
So this will get when we get to atheism.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that comes into that.
Back in, what, 70s?
Back in the 70s,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, actually, it comes from Nietzsche.
What's that?
It comes from Nietzsche, the philosopher. So Nietzsche had this, and it kind of gets a bad rap, but he has this this parable, this anecdote, where this guy comes rushing into the modern man, and he's crazy, and he's like, "Where's God? Where's God?" And this is what Nietzsche's talking about, because he's thinking through, okay, as we're moving away from God, he's thinking this is society. So this crazy man runs to these people, to the modern men. He's like, "Where's God? Where's God?" They're laughing at him, right? Well, God's a fairy tale. They go, "Oh, did you lose him? Well, maybe he's here, or maybe they're making fun of him." And this is where that quote comes in. He says, "No, God is dead, and we have killed him." And what Nietzsche's actually saying, he's actually dealing with the repercussions of this. If we're saying that God was just a fairy tale, God was just something, and now today we are modern and we don't need God, what kind of society is that?
Godless.
A godless society. And that's actually where Nietzsche's going with this.
Yeah.
Is he goes into, because Nietzsche's dealing with nihilistic ideas before they were cool. Like he's wrestling with these ideas. So the idea of God is not dead, or God is dead, and we have killed him, is Nietzsche's way of dealing with this idea of, okay, in a modern world where we say we don't need God, what kind of world is that? And it's actually a very profound thing. Because really, we as Christians can go, yeah, if you take God out of the equation, what are we? We're a bunch of pack animals that destroy each other. Like, look at our society today, a godless society. This is the result of that. And then the God's not dead is a response. It's a Christian response to that idea. Don't worry, he's not dead. God's still in control. And so, yeah. So some basic beliefs of modernism that you'll see in atheism and agnosticism is reason is king. Like your mind to be able to figure these things out is the ultimate reality. Like that is the most important thing. Observing the natural world through the scientific process is how we know anything. So these are kind of the answers to those questions. I don't know if we talked about those questions. And then God or gods are myths to explain what we know through science. Like we kind of already covered this stuff, but this just gives you kind of an overview of the basic belief. So reason is king. Observation is how you know anything. Whoops. Sorry. And then gods are myths. That's basic what the idea is. So those are just some basic beliefs. Here's some more. So Brian Applewood, he was a British author, The Culture Club, Crisis in the Arts. He wrote in 1984, modernism may be seen as an attempt to reconstruct the world in the absence of God. So without God, if you are here, right, you're at deism, and God's not there, right, because he left, how do we live in a world that doesn't have God? So what this guy's saying is modernism is the answer to that question. How do we live in a world without God? And so, all right, so we're just going to go, how does the modernist answer the questions? So the natural world around us, the natural world that we can see and interact with, that's it. So remember how in deism we say God is the prime reality? Okay, deism said God created the natural world, that's the prime reality. Now we're at the point of it's just the natural world. There's no God, no nothing, that's it. And then that external, right, the external world, it is a solid closed system. There is no interaction from the outside world. It's a solid, there's nothing.
And
So
there is no afterlife.
There's no afterlife, there's no spiritual world, nothing. It's just, and so you can see open system, slightly closed system, completely closed system. And that's the movement away from God. So you can just start seeing that. So, what's the nature of where we're on? This universe was created by a natural chain of cause and effect with no supernatural interference. In Deism, they said God was the first cause. Now they say we don't need God. It's just the internal causation. So that's where we are now. All right, we ready? So number 3. Number 3 and 4. What is a human being? Human beings are evolved machines. Okay, so that's it. Because we're in this closed system, nothing created us, so we must come from the closed system. We must just be machines, highly evolved machines. This is why evolution takes a hold in the modern mind. Because without God, you need something to create us. Like we as humans need the understanding of creation. Where did we come from? Right? Even little kids, they ask, where do I come from? Right? Because we have this innate need to know where I come from. Where you come from, mom and dad. You know, grandpa came from, Scotland, and your family's from this. Like, they need to know. Why? Because we all need to know. So evolution gives you a reason why you are here. Then what happens to a person after death? You cease to exist because it's all within the closed system. No one's getting out. No one's getting in. So it's all a part of that. So you just cease to exist. So number 5, why is it possible then to know anything? It's all done through study and experimentation. It's the scientific method, right? So I have a hypothesis. I test that hypothesis. I learn from it. I create a new hypothesis. I retest it, and I go through the whole thing, and I come to a conclusion. That's the only way to know anything. So it's taking the reason, and now it's putting in the study. That's what's happening. So from here, it's because God gives us a brain through special and general revelation. Now it's just general revelation. Now it's just us. Now it's study that creation, or it wouldn't be even used as that, just be the world. So then in number 6, how do we know what is right and wrong? We can know right and wrong based on how it helps or detracts from human society and culture. So this is actually something that I have had a lot of conversations with people. Why is it wrong that the Nazis killed the Jews? Well, because it is bad for society to kill that many people. That's the answer. Why is it wrong for someone to murder? Well, for society, that's bad. Like, that's the reasoning. It's not that God created that person in the image of God, and therefore they have worth, they should be respected, they shouldn't be just murdered. This comes back to the whole idea of capital punishment, right? If they did something worthy to take them out of society, that's different. But just to kill them for no reason, that's called murder. And so, but it's on a completely different level because there is no God. We can only work within here, so therefore, good and evil has to be understood through our own personal experience, or what happens now, right? And so that's kind of the idea here. And then the final one, what is the meaning of human history? It's to help us grow as a species, but in the end, it has no overarching plan or point. There's no cosmic being directing this. Therefore, what's the purpose of my life? There really isn't. There's no purpose. It's just, I'm a part of a chain of a cause and effect, and I was a product of it, and I'm going to be just adding to it to my kids and their kids and society and the society after me. So the Roman society is just as worthwhile as the Nazi society, and the Nazi society is just as worthwhile as the American society, and they're just going to be as worthwhile as any society that comes after us. It's all that cause and effect idea. And so, what can a Christian take away from all of this? Is just this idea that we can use reason and science to know God, right? This argument stuff. Like, we can use this to understand that God exists. We can go and do archaeological studies And this is why our archaeology just boomed in the 1800s and 1900s, is because of the modernism. And so thanks be to God for that, because now we know that the scriptures are more reliable than anyone ever thought. Like, it's so reliable that it's ridiculously reliable. Like, the guy, there's a scholar that once said that we have an embarrassment of riches to the New Testament. Like, we have so much of the New Testament that we can know that we know that we know that was written by Paul and by Peter and by John is what we have today. Like, it's just ridiculous how well God has preserved his word. And we get that through the modern worldview. So that is good. And then this is just kind of going back to that type of argument. Because God is a God of order, his creation is in order, therefore because of God we can know the universe, right? That's a modern way of thinking. That's an A plus B equals C type of idea. And then as we learn more and more science doesn't disprove God, but rather true science actually leaves the room for the possibility of God. And this is actually becoming more and more of an issue. Like, the whole idea of the perfect place, like we are in the Goldilocks zone of both our solar system and our universe. That comes through the modern way of doing things. And so we have just great things because of the modern thing. Now, there's a lot of issues too with the modern, but because of the modernity, we have this type of stuff, right? And so science doesn't disprove God. And actually, it actually pushes us to know God even more. And when coupled with his word, we actually make discoveries. So I forget the guy's name, but he was reading in the Psalms and it says the waters have passages, like there's ways in the waters. And so he goes, I wonder if that's true. And so he actually found that we have currents, right? There's actually waterways through our oceans, and you can actually get on those things and it helps you go. And so he discovered that by reading the scriptures. And it's more of a modern way of doing things. So, how can the Christian reach out to the modernist? It's through reason, right? Using tried and true connecting arguments. So, if C is a cause of B, where did B come from? Right? Like that. This is just a simple way of asking this question. So, if the world caused me, okay, where did the world come from? And since we know, this is going back to this one, we know that the universe is not eternal because of what science has told us, then materialism was wrong, Hinduism was wrong, must be an Abrahamic faith. Like, that's where this stuff comes into play. And so this is just modern thoughts. The answer, therefore, must be A. A has to create. And so, who's at A? It's Jesus. So that's how we get to that. That's a modern way of understanding who God is. All right. Are you guys up to doing this? Or is it you just like too much? I know it's been a lot. Deism and modernism, it's a lot. You want to try to hit agnosticism at least? I don't have a no or yes, but I do have like,
Yeah.
I need a verbal answer. Yes or no? Do you guys want to do it? Yeah? Okay. Too many people said yes. All right. So I'll try to hit it real quick. This is actually my favorite one. So agnosticism. Grace Slick, he was a musician. He says, I think of myself as a positive agnostic. I don't know, therefore I'm open. I don't know, therefore I'm interested. So that kind of sums up what agnosticism is. A definition, a person who holds that the existence of the ultimate cause as God and the essential nature of things are unknown and unknowable, or that human knowledge is limited to experience. Okay, so this is basically the idea that you're just going to keep hearing over and over again. Agnostics don't know. That's it. Like, if you want to sum up the whole of agnosticism, it's I don't know. How easy is that? There's more to it, obviously, but So what the definition I use is a person that does not know whether God / the supernatural world does or does not exist. Like, when we're talking, that's what we're talking about. Do you know? So you go up to someone. Do you believe in God? I don't know. Oh, you're agnostic. Like, how one question, and all you have to say is I don't know, and you go, oh, so you're agnostic. Yeah. And then there's more to it. Like, you can ask other questions that get a better sense. But do you believe in God? I don't know. Oh, you must be agnostic. Do you believe in God? No. Are you atheistic? Yes. One question, you can split and understand someone. So the history of Agnosticism. So Agnosticism has been around in some form or another in many different cultures, Greek and Hindu philosophy. But this type of agnosticism was called skepticism. So agnosticism, the modern idea is there a God or not? I don't know. The ancient form of it, when they would use it, they just meant you were a skeptic on things. It could be anything. I'm a skeptic on philosophy, on your philosophy. I'm a skeptic on this. I'm a skeptic on how the gods made the universe. But there was always that belief, that standard belief, that I do believe that there is supernatural. I do believe there is God. It's just I'm skeptical on what that means. And so that's ancient agnosticism. So that we need to understand that, because people will be like, well, I'm a skeptic. Okay, what does that mean? Right? Like, I'm a skeptic. Like, I'm skeptical about everyone. Like, I might not look it, but like, I question everything. Like, it doesn't matter what it is. I don't care who you are, what your background is. I don't believe anything you say. Like, I'll take it as you give it to me. Okay, I'll believe what you say, but I'm not going to 100%. No one has my 100% belief, because I don't know. Like, I don't know anyone, right? Do any of it? It comes back to that question: do any of us actually know anyone? You know, people will say, "Well, I knew that person," like a serial killer. Like, have you ever seen those serial killers? They're like, "Oh, they were the best person. They were my neighbor. Oh, they were someone in a church. You know, they were all this." And then I couldn't believe that they were a serial killer. Well, you weren't skeptical, right? You didn't see the problems there. And so there's a difference between skepticism, being skeptical of something, and being agnostic. And so, philosophers such as Aristotle and Theseus, such as Thomas Aquinas, believed that you could use rational arguments to prove the existence of God. Okay, so we're talking agnosticism. Okay? This is just a history of it. So these people believe that you could use rational arguments to prove the existence of God. This was followed by philosophers such as Kant, Kierkegaard, who believed that this was not true and that it would be better to abandon such arguments. So as modernism approached, and this is why I say I don't think modernism is just the 1800s. Like, modernism starts with the Renaissance and moves into the Enlightenment, and moves into the 1800s, because these guys are writing during this time when modernism is starting, and they're already moving beyond modernism. Modernism is all about reason, being rational, and these guys are saying, can we really do that? And so you start seeing this agnostic idea.
Stephen Myers, this philosopher.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot. There's a lot of these philosophers that have all these different ideas. And so in 1869, the philosopher Huxley used the word agnostic to define his own thoughts on the belief of God. So he starts this modern use of the term agnostic to show this is who I am, right? As I don't know. And so philosophers that follow Huxley embrace the thought of not being able to know or even reason if there was a God or the supernatural. So this is really, when we start talking about where does agnosticism come from, here you go. The modern thing is from Huxley. He was the one that was kind of developing, he would use this ancient idea and say, okay, that's who I am. Except I don't know if I can prove God. And if I can rationally come to this point of understanding who God is. So that's Huxley. And so this is where we start seeing an actual divergence in the modern uses and the ancient use of skepticism when it comes to Agnosticism. So, modern day atheist Richard Dawkins makes a distinction between agnosticism and atheism, which he says depends on how close to zero someone would be willing to rate the probability of the existence of God. So he would say, okay, here's a probability. 0 means that there is no God. 100% means that you're a Christian, right? And he says, the closer you get to here, you'll come to this point of agnosticism, and once you get to here, you're an atheist. That makes sense? So that's just what he's saying. That in his mind, it's just the closer you get to 0, the more atheistic you are. And when you start moving away from 100% belief in God, you're agnostic. And so this is why at the very beginning, there was that quote that said, Christians say we're theists, but we can act agnostic. Right? So when we say, God, do this, and then we do it, we're like, well, I'll do this in my own strength. We're actually acting as if God's not there. In the form of deism, what he said. But, all right, so there's 3 types of agnostics. Okay? Agnostic believers, people who do not know if the supernatural exists, but would tend to believe it does. So these are people that, does God exist? I don't know, but I hope he does. Like that type of person. That's an agnostic believer. Just someone that, yes, they don't know, but they want to believe. If given a good reason to believe, they would believe. But they don't know. And so someone like that, you can actually evangelize pretty good if you share the gospel, if you know some of these arguments and you can live it out. Like that's really, and especially in the modern agnostic, they're looking for the real life living out of someone's life, not just the words. But they might need the words too. There's agnostic atheists. These are people who do not know if the supernatural exists, but would tend to believe it does not. So they would go, I don't know, but I really don't think it does. That would be an atheistic agnostic. So if we're going back to this percentage thing, and we say 50% is the agnostic, if you're above 50%, you're the agnostic believer. And if you're below 50%, you're the agnostic atheist. Now, that's just kind of a dumb way of looking at it.
How do you get agnostic, atheist?
Yeah, well, because it's just, is there a God? I don't know if there's a God, but I don't think there is. So they lean towards the atheism. That's all it means. Yeah. Sorry. And then the empirical agnostics. Okay, so only believe the physical evidence and will not believe in God until such physical evidence can be produced. So this is actually something that's really, these I would say are the hardest ones to reach, because unless you have, I would say it like this. In the Gospels, you have this moment where Thomas is standing with the rest of the disciples, and they're like, oh, Jesus is risen, Jesus is risen. He goes, I will not believe it until I put my hand in his side. That's empirical agnosticism. I will not believe it until I put my hand in his side. So until Jesus appears, I will not believe it. So there's no, you can't do these arguments with that type of person. They will only believe physical evidence. So how can you do that? You love them, you pray for them, you show them Christ. That's the only way to reach someone like that. Because they will not believe until they're the Thomas and they put their hand in the side. And so that's not something we as Christians are here to produce. We're not here to produce those things. We're here to live out our lives as witnesses. So, all right, the 7 questions. What is prime reality? The really real, the natural world, right? That we can see and interact. That's the same thing as modernism. It'll be the same thing as atheism. The real world is only the material. It goes back to this one. It's only the material. Okay? What is the nature of external reality? The universe was created by a natural chain of cause and effect with no supernatural interference that we know of. That's the key there. That we know of. So when we get to atheism, it's going to be almost the exact same thing except without that we know of. Because that we know of is the question, is there a God? We don't know. That's agnosticism. Does that make sense? But you can tell that we're starting to move further and further away. And so, it's a descent of man in a different idea. Alright, we ready? Next one. Alright, what is a human being? Human beings are most likely, now listen to the language, are most likely evolved machines.
Evolved machines.
Yeah, but they're most likely. Right? So this would be an atheistic agnostic. Give me a reason why we're not evolved machines. Like, that's the idea. The agnostic wants a reason to believe. And so until they have that belief, they can only go off of the natural world, which is evolved machines, like that belief system. What happens to a person at death? Human beings most likely cease to exist. Again, that's one of those things. We don't know. It's most likely because I don't know, right? I know people die. I don't know where they go, right? I've never experienced that, therefore I don't know. That's the idea. That's the agnostic idea. And why is it possible to know anything at all? Human beings can know the world around them through study and experimentation of the physical world. That is a modern idea. So the agnostic, well, I can know things because of the scientific method. I can know things through the experimentation. I can know things by walking through. And so, it's just the same as any modern idea. It's just through the study of the physical world. So that's it. And then the last two, how do we know what is right and wrong? Again, we can know right from wrong through observation of the natural world and how it would help or take away from the human experience. This is the same thing that you get in the modern overview. It's the same thing you're going to get in the atheistic approach. It's observation through human experience. That's it. So, and then the final one, what is the meaning of human history? To help us grow as a species, but in the end, it has no overarching plan or point. So this is, again, without knowing, the only thing that an agnostic can believe is what they see for themselves, which is, there's no plan for my life. There's no point. People are born, people die all the time. Most people will have no effect on this world for any meaningful, so there's no point. Like, that's the idea. So.
Elon Musk, I just watched him the other day, is saying that we're going to get AIs that will fight wars.
Yeah. AI is going to be a big, interesting thing in the years ahead. All right, so what the Christian can take away from the agnostic? There's a sense that we must live with some of the unknown. So why did that kid get cancer? Come on, Christian, why did the kid get cancer? And my God, like, I don't know. Like, there's a certainty, there's a part of life that's uncertain. This is why Paul says things like, we look through a glass darkly. Like, we don't know everything. And no Christian would ever say that. Well, I mean, there are people that would say that. But God doesn't allow us to know those things. Now, after the fact, like, there have been times when people, like, a kid gets cancer, I don't know why, and then the result of it, like 3, 4, 5 years down the road, this is why. But no one knew at the time. Job is a perfect example of this. Job has no idea through the whole 42 chapters of why. We do as a reader, but he never finds out the answer. God never reveals the answer. So it's always a mystery to Job. And so there is a sense of the unknown. Like we can be okay with that. We, as Christians, we need to become comfortable in the unknown. Like, okay, God, I trust you. Like that's where we have to be.
Called faith.
Yeah. So we live by faith, right? We hope in the things unseen, right? And so we, like the agnostic says, I don't know. Goes, look, I don't know everything. I know that Jesus saves. I know that he was resurrected. I know that he's in my life. I know I'm going to be with him for eternal life. Everything else, I don't know nothing. Like, those are the only things I know for sure. And to the agnostic, you can know that too. Like, but there is a lot of mystery, even in our faith, like when it comes to stuff like that. And we should be okay with that and be honest about it. We cannot know everything. Therefore, there is a lot in this world that we must admit to not understand. Like, it's okay to say I don't know. Like that's okay. If someone says, "Why this?" and we go, "I don't know." That's okay. God knows. I don't need to. But it's one of those things that sometimes Christians we can try to know. We can try to like every little thing we can figure out. It's like it's okay not to know something. Like we are finite. We just go to the one who knows. We seek, we ask, we knock. That's what we do to the one who knows. How can the Christian reach out to the agnostic? We need to show that God is real through sharing our lives. This is a big thing, especially in the postmodern. Once we get to the postmodern, this is huge. Like this understanding is huge. Is living out your faith. It's monumental. Arguments can only go so far, but the actions of the church and the believer can reveal spiritual truths too. So for the believer who goes through a hardship, to the agnostic who's watching, and they go, why do you trust Jesus when you don't know what's going to happen? It's because I know he knows. And whatever the reason he's allowing me to go through it, I still trust him. That speaks volumes to people. This is the whole story of Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr goes to the stake, he dies, and people come to Christ because of his example of going to die for his Jesus. Like that stuff is huge. And so just living, as they say, a sold out life to Christ is monumental. So then we can stop there because it's 7:30 and we can talk about atheism. So some of you won't be here. You're taking off. So, yeah. Any last thoughts? I'll finish this up next week no matter what. I'm just going to bulldoze through it. Any last thoughts before we stop? As we talked about Theism, Modernism, and Agnosticism. I know it's a lot. It is a lot.
So with this climate change and the weather and whatnot, what drives those people to believe that they can actually control the weather around the world, I guess?
So that would stem from a postmodern worldview. Because one thing that we'll see is you go from agnosticism to I don't know, that question, to atheism, I know there's no God, right? To how can I live in a world with no purpose? That's nihilism. And then when you get to, have you ever heard of the term existential crisis?
Sort of, but I don't know nothing about it.
Right, so when someone says I had an existential crisis, it means everything they believed came crashing down and then they had to build back up. Like they had to reanalyze the whole world. And that's the end result. So once you get to nihilism and you come to this without God, there is no purpose, there is no nothing, right? Existentialism is I have to then create everything, my own purpose, my own world. And so the postmodern is this idea of we've rejected everything and now we have to find purpose. So how do we find purpose? Well, we find purpose in climate change. So we try to fix the world.
Or
Because
build
that
back
gives us-
better.
Yeah, we try to, well, yeah, because the idea of we can build everything and create
Yeah.
something is part of the idea. And so why do you have a lot of people who are liberal believing these things? Because the liberal mind state is actually a part of a postmodern. That's the thing that conservatives miss when talking to liberals, is they're talking actually from two different worldviews. The conservative worldview comes from a modern place, whereas the liberal mindset, the progressive liberal, let me make that clear, because true liberalism is actually from the Enlightenment. But the progressive liberal is coming at it from a postmodern worldview. So you're not just having the clash of ideas, you're having clashes of worldview. Like, how do you actually interpret the world? And so that's why you can demonize, because they're not even a part, like, it's a whole different world. The way it would be if you didn't understand someone's language, right? And you met someone that spoke a language you didn't have no idea. And you have miscommunications, and then there's problems coming from that. That's kind of an equivalent, where you have a worldview that's coming from one side, or another worldview that's coming from a different side, and now you have to live at the same place, and they're clashing. That's what it is. And so it's deeper than, for us as believers, there is this underlayment of understanding that it's a spiritual battle. Like that's, so underneath everything, it's a spiritual battle. When you come up to the physical plane, then it's worldviews are clashing, at least in our society, worldviews are clashing, and not religious worldviews. So it's one thing to have a religious worldview between two parties, but you still have a basic belief. And so now in our society, before really the 1960s, our society was all on the same page in general. We all had at least a fundamental belief in God. But since the 1960s, we don't have that. And so that's why you see such a rapid deterioration of our society, is because we're becoming more and more distant in our worldviews. And because of that, you're seeing when those worldviews come together in politics and environmental issues, there's such a just bashing, because it's just completely difference in worldviews. So it's a lot to go, for all that. But it's kind of like when you have a teenager in the house and you just clash with them. It's because their worldview is, I'm becoming an adult, you need to treat me like an adult. Whereas the parent's worldview is, you're a child and you are acting as a child, and therefore I'm going to treat you as you act. And it really is. And we can see that, right? Like, those that tend to be more conservative usually tend to be older. Why? Because they live life, they understand that the government is horrible, they don't want to give their money to the government. So where the younger ones are like, no, we need to help everyone, very idealistic and things like that. And the more that these two worldviews clash, they're going to tear at each other more and more. And in our society, that's where you get things like civil wars. Because if we look at our own Civil War, it was a states' rights issue. It was this belief of you can't own a person, right, compared to slavery. Like, is someone property? Is someone not? Like, those are clashes of worldview, even though the underlying worldview was the same. It was a Christian worldview. But there was another layer to that led to the Civil War. And that's nothing like we have today. Like, as far as worldview issues. I'm not saying the severity of the issue, but worldview clashing. We've never had such a thing, and so that's why we'll probably get to a civil war, because you can't keep at this in the society we run.
We're more divided today than we were in the 1860s.
Yeah, we really are.
So,
Yeah,
so there will be a civil war.
yeah, and that's the thing. And
We
so
won't be here.
Don't say that, we may.
But yeah, that's one of those things. It all comes down to worldview. But as Christians, we know it's also a spiritual issue. Like, it doesn't matter where you line up on these issues. The underlying issue is sin, and until that's dealt with, everything above that, it's kind of like when you put, when you. This might be kind of gross, but you put usually your most disgusting thing at the end of your you don't want your toilet backed up into your bathtub, right? And so that's sin though, right? And the backing up into the bathtub is, we see the mess that we're in, but the problem is the toilet being backed up into the bathroom, and that's the sin. And so everything we see now is a result of sin, backed up. And so, and unchecked sin, this is why what was so good about the Great Awakenings was sin was checked. It was, no, we need to get back to God. No, we need to get back to God. Billy Graham, we need to get back to God. But when we start seeing less and less of that, and sin becoming less and less checked, that's where we get to where we are today. So, it doesn't matter the worldview. Because Christianity can work within actually any other worldview. But unchecked sin will always lead to the junk that we're dealing with.
We just have to remind ourselves every day, God is in control.
Yep.
That's the only thing that gives me peace. Otherwise, I start raving and ranting,
Yep.
watching Raph, and I think,
Yeah. Yeah. And it really
God
is.
is in control. He's allowing it.
Mhm.
Why? I don't know.
Right. And it's all,
But he's gone.
everything's marching towards that great and glorious day of the Lord where he
Yeah.
will return. So I mean, we know as Christians in the scriptures that's why. That's why the world gets worse. That's why technology rapidly changes. That's why we have all these issues. It's because God basically has gone, go for it. Why? Because he's getting us to that point.
The United States isn't mentioned in Revelation. The word non-existent.
You know? Or we're just not important enough.
Well, that's what's happening.
Yeah.
God's clearing the way.
Okay. So, but no matter
We'll
what,
still vote for Trump.
God is in control.
Main thing is be ready.
Yeah, it is. And that's really, every time that Jesus talks about the end times, it's all with the purpose of just be ready. You know,
Yeah.
be ready, be prepared for what's coming. If you live through it, great, sucks to be you, but if you don't, great. But be ready.
In the end, we still win.
Yeah,
No
Christ
matter-
will rule, and those that bow down to him now will live forever, and those that don't bow down for another won't have a good time.
It's like this thing that comes on TV, heaven or not.
And it really is, that is the choice. It's not heaven and then one of a multiple choice.
No,
It's heaven or
you can't
not.
choose one.
Yeah. All right, well, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this evening. Thank you for being able to get through a lot of material. Lord, we pray that our brains would not break. Lord, that we would be motivated to share the gospel with those, especially through the lives that we live, even in the world as it grows darker and darker. But we as your people, we look forward to the day of light as our King returns. And so, Lord, we thank you. We praise you. I ask for everyone in here to get home safely, but also those that will be leaving back to their homes up north, that you would protect them on the road and give them safe travels so they can get home, they can praise you, and that we can be praising them, or you with them as they go. So Lord, we just thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.
No, we,